Hello everybody, and thank you very much for coming this morning. My name is Absolute, or a lot of people call me App, and I'm the founder of the Stormwolves community. So I've joined the Stormwolves just before Legion, and I've been raid leading pretty much for 3 years on and off since then. And today I just would like to do a little bit of experiment and share some of the thoughts about the role of the DPS in the raids. Look, I understand that obviously I don't know everything, and a lot of people also have some gaps in the knowledge, so I'm not really a Mythic World First Raider. And you probably should do a little bit of research, but hopefully after today you will have a little bit of extra knowledge that you can apply to improve and to focus your playstyle into a different direction. So what I've done, I've basically done a lot of research and I've combined all of the different methods that have been recognized by really good players around the world as being effective, and they generally will try to increase your DPS in raids, your general awareness, and sometimes it can help to improve your playstyle as well. Basically, yeah, it's just a mixture of my personal experience and, fantastic guides from Preach and Method and people like that. And that's pretty much for our little introduction. So let's have a look at how this module is going to be structured. We're going to be having a look at internal improvements, external improvements. Then I will be going through a couple of tests that we can do to improve our DPS in the end. And obviously there will be some questions and answers. So what's the internal and external improvement? Basically, when you're playing your role as a DPS in the raid, you've got yourself resources available to you that are given by the game itself from the beginning, and then you have external stuff that you can also use to help you to see things better, to adjust your settings and get your positioning and procs right, stuff like that. So internal is basically anything that to do with the game itself, and external is something that, again, from the outside source. So we'll start with the internal improvements, and before we go into the deep things, I would like to share some of the thoughts about the philosophy of DPS. Essentially, the main role for the DPS in the raids is that you need to be positioning yourself and standing in the right spot and killing adds at the same time very quickly. Every single boss, every single encounter in World of Warcraft has been designed that way. If you stand in the right spot, either to increase your damage or avoid damage or help out with, with buffs to be a team player, all of that comes to the positioning if you do it the right way. And if you kill all of the adds at the same time quickly enough, every single boss encounter will be defeated, no matter what. This is literally two most important rules for the DPS. So how can we improve that, and what should we be looking at? Obviously, different classes will have different strengths and weaknesses. When it comes down to rotations and your priorities of how you're pressing the buttons, some people will find their rotation very simple, with like 4 or 5 buttons to press. Some people will find a lot more. It varies class by class. But also what's important to know is that when you make a small research about your class, when you read about it on in your spell book with your spells or in some external guides and stuff, you need to understand clearly what your class is really capable of doing at the best. For example, Affliction Warlocks and Shadow Priests and Wombkins, they're pretty much amazing at spread cleave and sustainable cleave. Basically anything that is multi-targeting, they're really, really strong. But unfortunately, they're actually not as strong when it comes down to single target. Or they can be definitely weaker than that to a single target gods, like rogues, for example, or warriors. Some of classes have extremely high burst, right? So in the beginning, they will do a lot of damage, but then it sort of slows down in the end. Things like that, if you understand exactly what class you're playing, then you will apply that to the rest of your fight, essentially. So you play for your strength and try to minimize your weaknesses. So as we've been talking earlier, for example, very simple rotation comparison between a couple of classes. Priority list of Affliction Warlock, for example, versus the priority list of damage for a Beastmaster Hunter. I mean, clearly there are differences there. Obviously, we also know that the game gives us an ability to choose talents to specifically tailor ourselves to a fight. If the fight has only single target and no adds are present, you will choose one set of talents. If it has more targets, you will choose multiple set of targets. It's a self-explanatory stuff, but unfortunately a lot of people do tend to overlook it. They tend to just copy and paste builds from the guides because they think that, well, if the guide says this is the way to go, then you don't have to think about it. What I'd like to do when I'm researching a new class, I like to actually read everything what's going on and actually just understand in my head what particular talent can be applicable for a situation. Because that way I can sort of tailor myself and think, okay, for this a 2-target situation, then maybe this particular target will be better. And I will try it out. And then I will see, okay, am I correct here or not by going to some external sources that we'll be looking after later, and I'll be confirming my suspicions whether or not the top players in the world will be doing stuff that I thought was a good idea. And if not, then obviously I will try to readjust and understand why the talents that I chose were basically wrong. Obviously there are very different customizable options for specs when it comes down to their stats, secondary stats, and the Azerite traits. A lot of people again tend to overlook the power of secondary stats. They think that the intellect and strength, is basically the best stat in the world, and they tend to just pick up the high item level gear, not realizing that in a lot of situations where you have equipped your heroic level of gear, for example, at that level you're looking not at improving your item level as much, you're looking at improving your stats to give more and more and more damage output in the end. Item level is very good in the beginning to help you with survivability. Essentially, because of the higher level, you get more stamina. So when you come up with the new boss and the new mechanics, item level is definitely better then. But if you're trying to maximize your damage, and if you're trying to, again, kill those adds very quickly, then stats will definitely win. Same goes for the Azerite traits. This system is very interesting, and to be honest, I'm not really sure why a lot of people hate it so much when it comes down to how much variety it can provide. Right now, because we have so many different rings and so many different sources of Azerite gear, we can really tailor our character to different scenarios. Once again, single target boss, multi-target boss, cleave, and a lot of those traits are extremely powerful. The difference between two characters who play in the same item level, but one character has the best Azerite trait selected in the gear versus the character who doesn't, can be substantial. It can be, 2000 DPS, 3000 DPS, you name it. It's incredible how much things can be overlooked over there. Also, there is a small thing about structured versus intuitive playstyle. A lot of guys, when they go into the raid and they sort of know what the mechanics are like, they sort of understand what the fight is involving, and they sort of know how to play their class. It's very, very easy for them just to press buttons as they come. If they have procs, they just press it, not thinking when to really press the procs at the right time or not. It's easy for them to overlook things that they can move and cast something at the same time, or hit stuff at the same time while they're moving. They're playing very intuitively. Essentially, they think, okay, this is probably the best way of play, so I just stick to it. The opposite difference to that, when it comes down to your style, is that you know exactly which button to press at what time and why you're pressing it. You're thinking ahead. You're thinking what abilities from the boss will cast next. You would think where you need to be standing. Again, that idea about the positioning, standing in the right spot, comes up with this particular structured gameplay, where you tailor your playstyle basically minute by minute in intervals to see when your cooldowns line up. How can you maximize your damage? Those are two different philosophies, obviously. So we're trying to go away from the intuitive style towards structured playstyle, towards basically thinking. And that tailors together with this principle of ABC, which is always be casting. Now, this is just a general principle that a lot of the World First players will be talking about, and the name is a little bit deceiving. Even though it says always be casting, it doesn't really mean that it only applies to casters. It basically means that every single global cooldown you should be doing something, especially when you're a caster, but also if you're a melee DPS. You've got every single cooldown you can use to hit the targets. If your target is too far away, you need to make sure that you get to that target as quickly as possible so you minimize the downtime. There are a lot of good tools to use to check how much uptime on the boss you've got, basically whether or not you're hitting the boss constantly. So if you fall between 95 and 98% mark on your uptime on the boss, it's a very, very good target to achieve and practice towards. If you're above 98% on every single fight, it means that you're doing something really good, and you understand that, yes, you're not wasting those cooldowns, global cooldowns, that is. You're not wasting this potential damage output that you can be doing towards the boss. Now, that's when we start talking a little bit more in detail about positioning. So I've created these little subsections over here. So we tried to minimize the movement, we tried to avoid very silly and stupid damage, and we tried to think a couple of steps ahead, and obviously we tried to maximize our cliff potential. So over here, I've got a couple of screenshots done from World First kills. Some of them will be from Method, some of them will be from somewhere else. But this is an example over here that was done by the Demon Hunter on Gahun. This is a good picture to have a look at because of where he is positioning. The boss itself is huge, and his hitbox is also very huge. Now you can see that himself, the Demon Hunter, and a couple of other melee DPS are standing inside the hitbox. They're not outside of it, they're not like 2 yards outside or 2 yards in. He is basically inside it, making sure that no matter what the movement, because there's always a little bit of micro movement, the tank moves a little bit slightly to the left or to the right, the boss will follow. So you don't want to be standing just on the outside edge of the hitbox, because then you will have a second reaction time, which means you basically lost that second. If you're standing inside it, you're not going to lose it. That is another little screenshot from a Demon Hunter perspective. This is just to show the cleave potential for the melee DPS. This positioning over here from the Demon Hunter, he aligned himself perfectly from the AoE ability that he is doing, the I-beam. If you don't know what it is, essentially it's just a frontal cone that just does a lot of damage in front of the target. So he positioned himself so that he is hitting 3 adds. But what you don't know is that there are a couple of more adds in front of him outside of the screen. It's just the way that he is angling himself, you can't see it, but there's a couple of more extra targets there. So he's actually hitting 5 targets and not just 3. And obviously if he was standing, say for example, if he was standing here in the middle facing towards us, then he would only be hitting 2 targets. Simple things, common sense when you think about it, but in the middle of the fight people tend to forget about it. This particular example is on minimizing the movement as well. The screenshot is probably not the best quality, unfortunately, but what we can see here, we can see Balance Druid basically ready to avoid an ability. This is Zekvos in Uldir, and if you remember the Shadow Donuts, you know that he spawns the Void Zone, and then essentially as soon as this particular Void Zone disappears, it will appear on the empty spot where the boys are standing right now. So when you try to minimize your movement and maximize your damage potential, you want to make sure that you're moving as little as possible. So over here, when he is avoiding this void zone, he's standing right on the outside of it, because he knows he can squeeze in a couple of more casts before this void zone will disappear, and where he stands, he will only need to make 2 or 3 steps to the right, and then he can continue DPS. He can continue casting. He is not losing more time than required on the movement. This is an example from Legion. This is Coven of Shivara fight, and it outlines positioning to do multi-targeting and multi-dotting. Now, if you look carefully, you can see that there are 4 targets that he can potentially hit, and 4 targets that he potentially multi-dot. So this is Shadow Priest. So he's standing here in the void zone. If he stands outside of it, then he will take massive amount of damage and probably die. So he positioning himself in a way that he can basically target boss over here, another boss over here, and 2 targets on the sides. That's 4 targets that he effectively have put dots on. So he's doing damage to all 4 of them. Not only that, his positioning is also excellent because there's a nasty mechanic in this situation where he will have a little AoE around him, as well as all of the other players. And if they touch each other, it's going to be basically one shot and a wipe. So they all have to stand in this little tiny safe spot, but all of them are spread out in the way that none of themselves touching each other, and they will not touch each other. So it's a very, very good example of how can you stand in the right spot, maximize your damage, and also at the same time minimize any unnecessary damage that the raid will be taking. And we've all seen this particular meme. I mean, we all know that, yes, a dead DPS does no DPS, but it happens every time, and we all, make mistakes. Sometimes simply because we overestimate of how good we are. But hey, healers, they love you. Alright. One more thing that we can improve, obviously, is our key binding. This is the topic where a lot of people have different opinions, but what I've seen so far, explained by pretty much all of the professional gamers, is that there are certain little things and principles that everybody tries to keep together. You want to use your main abilities that you're using the most on the very simple to reach keys. 1, 2, 3, 4, Q, E, R, Z, X, you name it. If you try to put your main abilities on hard to reach buttons, like K, L, P, plus, minus, and stuff like that, then you will probably lose a little bit of reaction time because your hand will need to move there, and plus your focus will be shifted because it's very easy to miss rather. If you keybinded yourself to the O, for example, and then you move your hand, what's to say that instead of pressing O, you've pressed I or P? So keeping it very simple, that's the keys principle, is the name of the game here. And another small tip, if you are playing different characters and many alts, it is definitely the good idea to keep the same keybinds on the same type of abilities. For example, if I am playing on my Shadow Priest, on my Warlock, and my Warrior, all of my interrupts will be on the same button. If I need a defensive cooldown, all of the characters will have exactly the same keybind for that defensive cooldown. This way, you know basically straight away that no matter what character you play, whatever the situation is, the type of the ability that you have to deal with will be on the same keybinds, easy to reach, muscle memory kicks in, and you're maximizing your performance that way. One more thing about the internal improvements, and that's the proper use of trinkets and cooldowns that you've got. People think that If there is a cooldown, you should press it and it will increase your damage. Sometimes people think that if you chain your cooldowns one by one, then you will increase your damage that way too. However, what people don't really realize is that there is a multiplication effect. Sometimes you hear about it, but sometimes people don't really understand what it means. Essentially, you want to stack as many cooldowns and as many multiplication effects of your damage as possible in the shortest amount of window as well. So for example, if you've got a 6-second window where your trinket has procced extra crit, where there is bloodlust on the background, where you've got your personal offensive cooldown to use, and you've got a pre-pot, guess what? This 6-second window will basically provide so much burst that it will count towards the next 35 seconds of your damage. And that's only in 6 seconds. If you try to draw out every single one of them cooldowns one by one, you will never reach the same amount of damage output. It's just the way the games work, and that's basically how it's been designed from day one, essentially. These days, it's harder and harder to track the trinkets and effects, especially from Azerite gear, because there's just so many of those different buffs, and I think it's been done deliberately and a little bit sneaky from Blizzard's perspective, because they have seen the power of stacking all of those cooldowns together, especially if the player's actually thinking about it and they're really good at stacking things at the same time. So they've went away from that philosophy and they've actually started to design the gear in a way that, yes, you will still have a lot of those procs, but they will never be aligned together at the same time. That's why in the next patch, in 8.2, we will have some very interesting combination with the instances that Heart of Azeroth will provide. There's some potential for stacking of the cooldowns and overlapping of the cooldowns. Alright, so this particular section is done, and now we're just gonna brush over and move over towards the external improvements. Anything that we can use as the third-party tool, or anything that is not directly provided by the game itself, but still can give us a little bit of advantage, that's what we want to use, and this is what we're going to call the external improvement. So very first thing that we're going to talk about is the user interface. We've all seen different UIs everywhere. Everybody's used to seeing things on their screen one way or another, but there are some better UIs and there are some not so good UIs. But essentially all of the good UIs have the same characteristics, and that is how clean they are, what the actual camera distance and angle is, and how much information is relevant on your screen when you're looking at it. So let's have a look at this couple of screenshots. Now you can definitely see that this is probably not a very good UI. And it's not because of how busy and insane it is, but also because when you look at the character and you look at how much room around the character is covered by everything, obviously the awareness of what's going on is going to be way lower than if all of this crap wasn't here. It's a common sense, but you'll be surprised how many people still have UIs similar to this one. Now this is a UI that is extremely clean. This is my personal UI that I've created in the beginning of Legion, and I've designed it in this way specifically. I wanted to experiment and make it as clean as possible, and that's basically what it is. If I'm in combat, this particular weak aura, and we're going to be talking about the weak aura a bit later, will appear. When I'm not in combat, it will disappear completely. Similar to the nameplates, they will be sort of hidden, but then as soon as the combat starts, they will appear. And I wanted it to be that way, simply because I wanted to see as much world as possible when I started playing in Legion once again from my long break. So this was the deliberate decision. The lazy UI, as I call it, that I'm running with right now definitely needs a little bit more improvement, but this is basically what I see on the screen these days. And again, it's got very, very strong characteristic of being very clean, especially in the middle of the screen, in the middle area. And all of the important information that I need to look at will be, again, located closer to the center. That is boss abilities and boss cooldowns, and some of the raid information that I need to track. But apart from that, you can see that majority of my screen is pretty much clean. When we're talking about the angle of your camera and the distance to the boss, this is an example of probably not a very effective camera angle. I see it a lot with melee DPS. They like to zoom in way more than they probably should because they think that it helps them with hitbox and it helps them to see boss better. But there's a limit to how zoomed in you are to make it effective. The more you zoomed in, the less you will actually see happening around you. If you need to move from spot to spot as a melee, you really need to understand where exactly can you go and where's your safe positioning. For example, if you are a warrior and you want to leap outside of the boss to avoid the ability around him or frontal or whatever, if you zoomed in and you just randomly turn your camera around and hit the spot as far away from the boss as possible when you heroic leap, chances are you can end up in the fire, or you will damage somebody else by doing it, or you will not be, behind the wall to avoid the mechanic. And that's only because you've been zoomed in and focusing so much on the boss's ass that you completely lost with your surroundings. So zooming in is not a bad idea, but you must understand that it should not temper with how much awareness around during the fight there is. For example, this is a positioning and camera distance and the camera angle from a warrior's perspective. We've got Argus here from Legion, and essentially as he's positioned right on the hitbox, he's ready to go, he's pumping all of the damage, but check out the camera angle and camera distance. He's not looking directly on his legs, he's not looking underneath his butt, he is looking with like a angled perspective. That allows him to cover as much view on the entirety of the room as possible. So anytime he needs to avoid a certain mechanic under the boss, he will know exactly that over there is a safe zone and he will jump over there. If it's not a safe zone over there, he will see it and he will jump somewhere else. Now this particular screenshot explains the idea about the relevance of information on the screen. Of course, this is a very old UI, pretty much either from vanilla itself or it's from the Wrath of the Lich King Naxxramas. But you can see that there's so much information on his screen that potentially he doesn't need, or she, I'm not sure. For example, I don't think he would need to know all of the 40 members on the screen. I don't think they will need to know every single buff for himself and every single debuff on the boss. I don't think he will need to know every single buff from the raid that can be provided, right? All of that is completely irrelevant. And a lot of it is basically taking so much space on the screen that, the raid awareness itself will be diminished. So you think about how much information you've got on your UIs and whether or not you actually need all of that extra stuff while you fight. This is one of my screenshots that I've done in the fight. Unfortunately, this is not the DPS as such. This is my gameplay of the Discipline Priest in Legion. But again, the characteristics of this particular UI and this setup are exactly the same as I've been talking about. It's fairly clean in the middle. the camera angle and the camera distance allows me to see pretty much as I want. I'm still in a great view of the boss, and my main focus point is definitely the rate frames that I'm using. Who to heal, when to heal, how to heal. A couple of other information was little weak auras like this one, but they're discipline priest related. Again, this is customizable and we'll talk about it in a second. But also I've got the DBM windows and basically timers to let me know exactly when the big burst of damage will come through, so I will be able to heal. Again, this is not damage related, I understand, but an example of UI nonetheless. So when we're talking about the external improvements, this is where we step into this territory of add-ons. Now, a lot of the good players will tell you that it's completely okay and fine to play the game without any add-ons at all. Blizzard have designed it in a way that it's fairly easy to play. However, if we really want to improve ourselves and push ourselves a little bit harder, then we need to understand that in order for us to maximize our damage on the boss and the adds, and to stand in the right position at the right time, we really need a lot of help. There's only so much focus we can pay towards our damage, towards our rotations, towards our positioning, and listening to the raid leader commands. Eventually we'll basically end up in the butt spot. We'll be confused and our brain will just stop thinking. This is where add-ons come into play. They're designed to make your life easier. They're designed for you in this way that you can have a very quick glance and understand what's going on, at what time, and what you should be doing, like which kind of decision you should be making. Some add-ons, like Weak Auras and Tell Me Whens, they're basically focusing on your main abilities and cooldowns of abilities. You can customize them in a way that when they're on cooldown they're hidden, and when they're off cooldown they're not, so you know that if you see an icon you need to press that button, essentially. Some of the Weak Auras obviously do way more than just ability cooldowns. They do positioning, they do icons activated on certain mechanics. They literally can tell you in words that you need to get away from the fire or stack in a specific spot on a specific marker. There's absolutely no limit to what the Weak Auras can do these days. It's just amazing. So when you are thinking about yourself from the perspective of, okay, what can I have as a tool to improve my damage for my particular class, what I'm really good at, which particular tool can help me the most? It's one thing to basically go and copy the UI of your best favorite player and basically not understand anything what's going on in there, and it's a completely different story where you try to take your time and actually build that UI yourself. And to be honest, when I was creating UIs for myself for different classes, when I was learning to play different classes, I always tried to put everything in a very structured manner. And in the end of the day, because I paid a lot of attention to each element of my UI, I understood it better and it made visual sense. We're all different people, so what makes sense for you will be very different for what will make sense for me. So if you like specific icons, if you like text, or if you like, I don't know, colors and timers, you can plunk that in. As long as they're not distracting you from the actual fight itself, as long as they're still performing the role of helping you rather than distracting you, then this is the good setup. Now, this particular section applies to casters mainly, but sometimes it can be also applied to melee. We're talking about cast bars. There are some add-ons which are excellent to show you the cast bars of your enemy and the cast bars of yourself. And not only they will show you in a nice structured way of what's going on, but they will also show you how much latency you've got. And this is very important because the way that the game is designed, obviously when you press the button you need to send the signal to the server, and then the server has to respond and send signal back to you, and all of that takes time. If you live very close to your service, then that time is so minimal you cannot even feel it. However, in this particular situation, for this little screenshot, 512 milliseconds is half a second delay. So what it means that when the person pressed the Frostbolt cast, it will take at least half a second for the game to register that you needed to press that button and to respond and to actually cast it. What it then creates a situation where if you try to chain cast 2 Frostbolts at the same time, you have a gap between 2 casts. So you do cast number 1, there is latency and reaction time, and then you press the button again. And there's a big gap between the 2. So you would think that they're chained together one by one, but they're not. And it actually does correlate to the damage in the end. The more gaps you've got, even if they're microseconds here and there, the more damage you essentially lost. And your game will basically be registering that you're not casting and you're not following the ABC principle. That's what people are calling the ability snapping. And to eliminate that, there's a very cool trick that people are using, and that is they're spamming their casts. So what it means, say for example you cast a Frostbolt that we just talked about, it has a delay. If you know that, okay, I will start my next spell cast right on that marker where the delay is, to be honest, it's not going to be as effective simply because by the time you've put that button in, the game may not even register it, because at this particular microsecond the game will have this much delay, but then in the next microsecond when you decide to press it, the game will have more delay. So you will press the button to cast the next ability, but it might not even go off. And then half a second is lost and you press it again and think, oh holy crap, why didn't it work? It actually happens a lot for melee classes as well. When you try to chain your global cooldowns and you try to spam your abilities, sometimes they're not going to go off. Either because you're spamming them too fast, or because the game just have this micro delay and you're missing it and you're thinking, damn it, I should not have missed that particular attack. So the way around it is essentially start spamming the ability just before the delay. Because this way, the more you spam, the less delay the game will actually register itself. And that is why a lot of the good players, if you're watching their stream or if you're listening to their talk, essentially what you hear the most is pretty much stuff like this. That's why they're doing it. They just spam it as much as possible. Every single cast, every single ability, they're trying to spam it to minimize this particular gap, to make sure there's absolutely no delay whatsoever when the game is registering it. Another thing about the add-ons that can definitely improve your gameplay is the nameplates. Nameplates, obviously, in the game itself are probably not the best things ever, especially when you've got a lot of targets. It applies a lot for the casters who can multi-dot, but it also can apply to people like rogues, for example, because then they can choose and pick targets who to put poisons on, which is again multi-dotting for melee, but nonetheless. The two main add-ons that are the most popular right now for the nameplates are KUI and Tidy Plates. They do the same thing. You can make the nameplates larger, smaller. You can make the icons of the debuffs that you're putting on them smaller, larger. You can put timers on. Essentially, if you want to maximize your damage, you need to understand that, okay, I'm not just targeting one target and doing the damage to one target. If I want to do it to many others, or if I want to see where all others are, whether or not they're close enough for you to heroic leap, charge, shadow step, anything like that, you need to set it up in the way that you can reach them. And that can be done with nameplates. It's probably the easiest one to understand. Now we're coming to the dangerous territory. Stuff that a lot of people are a little bit afraid of, but nonetheless, they're excellent. The first one is Warcraft logs. It's universal accepted right now that there's a lot of information on it. You cannot fault the system itself for giving you the information, but you can fault people who interpret it in the wrong way. It is very, very easy to have a look at the log and not to understand exactly what the log is actually saying. So, to be honest, logs themselves probably will take an explanation on its own of how to use it properly, what to look for as a DPS. So I'm not gonna really spend a lot of time doing it. I'm gonna say that it is a very good tool to use. Even if you ask somebody like myself or Linda or Galahad just to talk about what we're actually looking at on those logs, how much damage you're taking, how much damage you're doing, what you can improve with your resource management, your timings, you name it. It's all going to be there. This is probably my favorite tool that I'm using, and I would definitely recommend it to anybody else when it comes down to the damages and DPS in raid. WoW Analyzer. WoW Analyzer is the website that has been developed back in Legion, and right now it's just insanely good. Because what it is a very informative and easy way to show you what exactly is wrong with your rotation, or with your general use of abilities, or general use of your cooldowns. It is designed spec by spec basis, and it's been improved by top players who are theory crafters all around the world to make sure that it does not matter which spec you're playing, it's going to give you the most relevant information every single patch. The way that it works, it's very simple as well. You find yourself a log from Warcraft logs that somebody recorded or you recorded yourself. You go to this website, wowanalyzer.com, and then you import that particular log code, like a URL, and then select the fight, select yourself, and you will see this. You will see that from your checklist, you will have some minor improvements to do, some major improvements to do. It will give you some suggestions. It will give you the stats of basically how much uptime you do on the boss. Always be casting principle is there. Anything you need to know. So if you're fighting a fight for the first time, or you've been doing it for an hour or so and you want to know how to improve it even more, this is the best tool ever. Especially when you're learning a class, the new one, when you start your new alt. If you learn it from the start based on the suggestions that the best players are giving you through this, then the quicker you will learn and understand what you actually need to do. And speaking of the best players and the best theory crafters, we do have an ability these days to join the communities, or at least follow the communities of those players through class discords and class website, also known as hubs. For paladins, it's the Silver Hand. For shamans, it's Storm, Earth, and Lava. Lock one-stop shop for warlocks. Ravenhold for for rogues. Pretty much nearly every single class will have their own little hub on the website, and it will have everything from the guides, the most updated guides to your specific spec, to tips and tricks on the bosses, to general discussion of what particular stats are good and what particular stats are not good, anything you need. And if you still don't find enough information in the hubs and you really want to ask a question, Class Discord is your friend. It's very easy to join. There's absolutely no limit to entry. You can just find it on Google, join it on Discord, and then 15 minutes later, because they usually put like a 15 minutes timer to eliminate all of the spam bots, 15 minutes later you will be able to ask a question. And if you're asking it in the prime time when everybody is online and majority of the moderators are online, you will get that information very quickly. So definitely don't be afraid of them. Use them if you need to. I think this one's going to be last. A very important external party tool that I would recommend, and that's the Simulation Craft and Raid bots. It's quick and easy. It's very, very quick and easy to see how much damage you should be doing in an ideal situation. Now, don't get me wrong, there is no such thing during the fight that is an ideal situation for you. You will never be able to stand in one spot and do your rotation or priority damage perfectly every single second for 6 minutes. It's impossible. The game is not designed that way. However, by saying that we know what our target should be, because it's been mathematically calculated for us, then we know where to go should we need to improve. How far are we away from that target to the ideal target? And this is where Simulation Craft and Raid bots comes in. Basically, it's the same program. It's designed on the same particular algorithm and spreadsheets, but with Raid bots, the website itself, it's just very easy. It was like 2 clicks. You select your character and you press the stat weights or you press the quick simulation, and boom. Less than a minute, you will see what you should be doing. Again, this is something that I would recommend for us to come next time and actually spend a little bit more time just experimenting with, pressing buttons together, just to see how it works. But if you want to explore it yourself, there are heaps of guides online. There are very good guides on YouTube of how to use it. Just be sure. This can be very tricky where you select wrong options. For example, if you input your character in and then you press that stat weight button, it will calculate the damage output based on the 5-minute fight in the patchwork situation where you literally stand in one spot. It's like a target dummy. However, if you did not select the right talent, then you will have the DPS output of the wrong talent. If you haven't selected the right buffs, then again the number will be different, and all of a sudden you press the button for quick simulation and it will give you the damage output, which is like 5,000 more than what you're currently doing, and you're thinking to yourself, how is it even possible? Why am I doing so little damage? Well, maybe because you didn't actually select the right options in the first place. So as I say, it's just a little bit, it can be a little bit tricky, and if you really need a little bit of guidance, seek out some help from YouTube or just talk to me about it. Alright, well, pretty much the main points that I wanted to cover are done, and then I will give you a little bit of examples of how we can improve basically on personal basis with a little bit of experiments and tests that you can do yourself at your own time. And then after that, if you have any questions, we'll talk about them. So the first one is very simple. It's just a very, very raw LFR test. LFR is a very good testing ground because there's not much abilities going on at the same time. There's not much focus that you need to draw away from your rotation, from learning the mechanics of your class and of your boss. And obviously there's no pressure. If you don't kill it, who cares? Nobody's gonna scream at you, it's LFR. So what you do, you record your DPS in the fight that you think is going to be the most representative. Usually we try to choose the single target fight like Grom, for example, in the latest raid. It's nice single target damage. Not much is going on in LFR, so you just record that DPS in Warcraft logs. Then you put that into WoW Analyzer. It will tell you what particular errors you've been making and what improvements you have. Whether or not it's minor improvements or major improvements. Try to focus on the major improvements first, and as you go and become better and better, obviously you can try to improve into the minor errors as well. So this is a very good example because you have your starting point where you recorded first. You understand what you need to improve. You go and do the same boss again, and then focus on that specific major improvement that was recommended, and try to see whether or not you've improved or not. Very easy test to perform. Another one is a little bit tricky for a lot of people, but it's also pretty fun to do when you think about it. So you've got yourself a blind dummy test. You set up your keybinds, and I'm really sorry if you are still a clicker. I'm just sorry, but keybinds is the way to go. Once you've done your keybinds, you stand on the dummy and you basically try to perform your best rotation, your best DPS as you can for 5 solid minutes. After you've done that, hide the bars away. Essentially, people are using Bartender or Dominoes or whatever add-on they prefer. So you have this option of hiding the bars and then try to do it again. If you hide the bars, the keybinds will be still there. You just don't see them. That's a very good test because then you will be testing your muscle memory. So you will be less reliant on your eyes looking at when the cooldowns come up to your muscle memory. This is also very good to incorporate with your add-ons and your weak auras to help you actually track the cooldowns of your abilities, because obviously it's impossible to remember exactly off by heart when to press, a 20-second cooldown ability. But if you have Tell Me When set up, if you have that weak aura set up, you don't really need to know which button to press, whether it's 5 or R or E or 1. You just need to know when to press it. And that's what we're trying to improve here. We're trying to take away your focus from what numbers represent which abilities to when you actually need to press it and have your eyes in the middle of your screen. So again, basically have a starting point, record what your 5-minute result is, then take your bars away, and then record the difference. And every time after that, keep on practicing and practicing and practicing until you basically eliminate that difference, or you're as close as possible to your, open dummy test. The next one is very useful when you are in the raid scenario with the group of people who you're not sure what are they capable of, as well as if you want to help the raid leader. Basically, you need to set up your DBM or your bigwigs in a way that you only see important abilities in a spot where you can clearly see it. Whether it's in the middle of your screen or to the right or to the left, doesn't matter. But as long as you see those bars pop up when the timer is low, say 10 seconds or less, that's what we're after. So once you set it up, again, you go to the very easy environment like LFR, and when you're doing the boss damage, make sure to focus your attention specifically to the abilities of the boss from those bigwigs or DBM. Literally say it out loud which ability is going to come next and how long it's before it's going to come up. So if it's a frontal blast, you say frontal blast in 10 seconds. Then you keep pressing your damage. Then you say frontal blast in 5 seconds. Then you keep pressing your buttons again. But you know that your focus is already paying attention to the frontal blast. It's going to happen. And guess what? Your reaction time will be immediate. As soon as he starts casting it, you know exactly, okay, this is what I've been waiting for. I'm out of here. If I'm standing in the right spot, I don't care. I keep on damaging it, and to be honest, that's what I wanted to do. I wanted to be in the right spot before the major ability comes out, so you don't have to move anywhere. The philosophy of standing in the right spot to maximize damage applies here as well. That's all you do here for the boss abilities test. You just read those abilities, the ones that will directly affect you, and make sure that you know when they are and you know where to look for once you set up your add-on. And finally, if you have absolutely no idea what damage you should be doing, even though you think you're pressing the right buttons at the right time, and you're practicing on your dummy for 10, 15, 20 hours, however minutes, but if you don't know mathematically what's your actual potential, then you have no idea whether you're doing the right things or not. So first of all, you will probably want to do this simulation test, where you put your character into the raid bots, you simulate your stat weights, and you simulate your character basically without any cooldowns, any buffs. And once you know the result, then you know that, okay, this is what I'm looking for at the 5-minute mark. This is what I should be doing. Then you just do your dummy test. You stand there for 5 minutes, and then you see if there's any difference. Easy stuff to do, but again, some people forget that that's probably the starting point where you need to be improving or learning a new class. Just try to find that particular difference. That is pretty much it, guys. The resources that I've used for my research over the years obviously were just experience, but also there are absolutely excellent people like Kripparrian, who was one of the best, if not the best, DPSs in Paragon during their reign from Wrath of the Lich King and Burning Crusade and Cataclysm. Obviously, since then, Method has been the best in the world, so their guides on your personal class, their guides on the roles, and the tips and tricks for each particular encounter of the boss is absolutely invaluable. Preach Gaming has been very, very good at teaching pretty much very similar stuff, if not all of it, that I've been talking about in the last half an hour or so. Then there are some class-specific people that are looked at that I would like to share, but it's basically a personal preference. They will be different to your specific class representative. For Shadow Priest, it's Angela. Angela's been fantastic in Legion, very easy to follow and very easy to understand. And Selvin Gaming, he's been doing just great guides on every single spec. If you need to have a starting point on how to play a certain class, his guides in BFA, in my opinion, were probably pretty much the best. Well, fantastic. Thanks very much for listening, and please ask me questions. So over here, ask me anything related to anything. You had a question about UI, you had a question about positioning, you have a question about the situation on any boss, you can ask that. Let's just have a small discussion, and then we can just wrap things. Feel free to shoot. Galahad?
It's not really a question, but I wanted to mention, you mentioned KUI and tidy plates as
Yes.
good plate add-ons. I moved from them to Plater, which I think came out on Legion. It's done by the guy that did details. It's really good for tracking your debuffs, and the main thing it brings the others don't is the ability to go to Wago and get some tiny mods that you can incorporate on it, which helps a lot with the Mythic Plus and knowing what stuff you should interrupt or not, because it changes like the color of the cast bars and everything, so it jumps out at you. So that's a good add-on if you're looking for a good plates add-on. It's a very good one to look into.
Awesome. Cool. Thank you. Good input. Anything else, guys? I'm sure you would have some questions. I mean, obviously a lot of this stuff is close to common sense, but don't be afraid. I don't bite. Honey, Rodessa. Okay, so you don't have any questions at all about just in general, like what to do in this situation or that situation. Okay, that's cool. Michael?
Meh.
All right. What about you?
I'm good. I have been reading up about Warlock because my DPS is way lower than it should be. I know.
Yeah.
Making changes, tweaking it, but I don't know. I think I panic in the moment. Don't stick to guns, you know.
That's fine. Did you do the dummy test? Just to see whether or not, without any panic, you're still pretty close to your target?
Well, I tried different changing talents, going to the dummy test. I do use a lot of keybinds.
Yeah.
But, I just can't seem to get my DPS up. I need to read more about rotations. And
Yeah, it's...
I think my rotation is probably still not right.
Again, that could be it, or that could be just confidence. Pressing them at the right time and making sure you press the actual right buttons, because sometimes for Warlock, if you're playing Demonology, there's a lot of to say how to maximize your imps, to make sure that a lot of them come at the right time, how to maximize your demon, what do you call it, Felguard, or just to make sure that he's not running around and doing some random crap rather than, you know, doing damage. There's a lot of things that you can potentially do, but I think as a starting point, at least, it's definitely good to make sure that if you choose the right talent setup, if you think that, okay, on this particular fight, majority of the warlocks are running with this particular talent, then you should try it out. And then when you select it, you need to make sure you know what's your maximum DPS potential in the first place, like what you should be looking at. Because if you don't know that on the first place,
I've never
Yeah.
reached the maximum, and I think a lot of it is down to my playstyle of just not doing things in the right order.
yeah, and your camera angle and your just general visual during the fight, is that still fairly clean and?
Oh yeah, it's all really clear. I hate loads of stuff on the screen.
Mm-hmm.
And my camera angle's pretty good. I'm zoomed out quite a long way.
Yeah.
Don't zoom in close.
Do you use any add-ons in terms of weak horrors or tell me whens, like to show you when the cooldowns are coming off abilities?
Yeah, I've got a few add-ons. I don't know what they're called, but they're the popular ones that I just picked.
Right.
But I think a lot of it is just I panic about trying to stay alive, trying to not stand
Aren't
in
we all?
stuff.
Well, that's something that everybody should be focusing on, and that's a good thing. It's a starting point. You make sure you're alive, because at the end of the day, if you're dead, you don't do any damage and you don't help anybody, right?
No, exactly. I mean, I could be pushing out 30k, but if I'm standing in crap and die in the first minute of the fight, I'm not pushing anything out at all. So,
And that's what the goal is.
Yeah, exactly.
The goal is to push as much as you can, maybe 25k,
But
while
to stay
also
alive.
avoiding stuff. Yeah, it's just one of those things. Well, thank you very much, guys. I appreciate it for coming, and I do hope that it was somewhat informative. If you have questions and just you want to have personal discussions about add-ons and about third-party stuff, like how to record the logs, how to read the logs, how to put yourself in the WoW analyzer, stuff like that, just let me know, and I will find some time and we can talk about it and discuss it together.